All right, our final panel discussion for the day. So reshaping the future of clinical trials for digital therapeutics. So if I can ask the panelists to come up, and I'll ask you to introduce yourselves.
Oh. I was like, where do we move? This is it.
All right.
We'll start
Hi.
with you.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody for staying. We know that we're standing between you and dinner, so we appreciate your attendance. My name is Kimberly Tableman. I'm the Chief Clinical Development Officer at Castor.
Hi, I'm Mona Dean. I'm Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Quality at Advocacy.
And I'm Athena Robinson, Chief Clinical Officer at Willbot Health.
Wonderful. They were efficient introductions, guys. All right, so let's start off talking a little bit about the challenges with current clinical trials as they apply to digital therapeutics. What ideas do you guys have about that?
Well, so I'll start. I think that digital therapeutics in general is just fairly new concept, and it's taking a while when you are designing, these clinical trials. You're trying to appease multiple audiences. You have physicians, you got payers, you have patients, and then regulators. So most clinical trials, in my opinion, and the one, from my background working on various ones, you're trying to generate clinical evidence and safety and efficacy data that might be sufficient for FDA or some of the notified bodies or some of the regulators. But it turns out that it's not the data the payers are looking for when they're trying to figure out, is this value added to their ecosystem? And I think some of that burden of proof is sort of unreasonable when it comes to clinical, digital therapeutics. In that sense, we don't expect drugs approvals, their initial approvers to go through and be compared to an existing drug. We want them to be then compared to a placebo. And that's not the case here, right? We're asking people to, or digital therapeutics to compare it to a sham device, to placebo, to standard of care. And it just makes it very difficult. And I think there needs to be consensus of what is expected? What kind of data are we looking for? And it could be cost effective. Again, digital therapeutics are not raising money like pharma does, where they can run long-term clinical trials for a long time and do follow-ups, and that's just not the case here for digital therapeutics. So I think that's been most pain point for the companies that I work for that I've seen.
And I would add, Mona, those are great points. I think another thing that hasn't been raised too much today, but I think is really important to touch on, is some of the limitations in recruiting diverse and minoritized populations when you look at traditional clinical trials. And decentralized clinical trials can have sites, but they can also be site-free. When we start to broaden the way we think about clinical trials and think about things being site-free, we kind of abandon this traditional notion of being tied to a particular provider or a particular site. We finally get to enroll the kind of diverse patient populations that allow us to generalize the findings of our study to people who are in real need. And that can also be people who are geographically not near any providers, these sort of rural areas where folks don't get to be really part of clinical trial care. And if you put two things together, maybe someone from a low SES background as well as a rural area, or someone who's working as a shift worker, the advantages of decentralized clinical trials really lend themselves to being available to do things like clinical assessments, et cetera, when someone doesn't really have to go into a site. So I think there are some limitations with current clinical trials and thinking about being geographically anchored.
Yeah, and certainly the reaching underserved populations. I'm so pleased you raised.
Yeah, and I would just build on what Athena is talking about, in the sense that I really feel like digital therapeutics and decentralized clinical trials are a perfect marriage.
Yeah.
That's what I call it. So that, decentralized trials really allow us to reach those diverse patient populations and to reach patients through digital marketing efforts that we just talked about, and then have a seamless patient experience from the point that a patient finds out about clinical research to the point of actually going through a pre-screening survey that they can complete online. They then can opt to enroll into the clinical trial. And even we enable at Castor, e-consent. So you're literally just going through the entirety of that process, and you're now in the trial. So I think that it's a real opportunity to leverage the decentralized clinical trial approach with digital therapeutics.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess if we think about where can we make changes in terms of how clinical trials are done to make that marriage one made in heaven, how can we really optimize and kind of think differently about how clinical trials are done in order to optimize their fit for digital therapeutics?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that one. But I would just say that it's this idea of being a little bit more light touch. So if you think about how we traditionally run clinical trials, and I do have a background at Pfizer and GSK in clinical development, and so historically we've looked for sites. You're kind of, as the patient, at the mercy of going into the right site, that specific doctor actually knows about a clinical trial that's going on, that then tells you about the clinical trial. And then you go through the process of enrolling in the clinical trial. And typically, historically, you have to go into the site on a regular basis, your visit schedule, to have your procedures done. So again, I think that what we're able to do now that is really different and overcome some of those barriers is allowing people to have visits at their home, right? Be able to be in the comfort of their home and be able to do data collection remotely. And then even talking about monitoring and looking at the data remotely. So rather than having to send a CRA in and doing the site monitoring on site, we can actually be looking at that data real time. So again, I think there's a lot of changes that we're seeing with the decentralized clinical trial model, and I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. And one thing that has come up a lot today is this theme around like patient centricity, which is fantastic. And I think that's why we're all here in the same room. Anyways, we're really thinking about the patient and in making meaningful change. And so whether or not that's through leveraging enrollment methodologies creatively that are fully digital, that don't rely on kind of pamphlets in someone's clinic office space, or that sort of traditional methodology of referrals that allows us to meet the patients where they're at, meet them on their social media platforms. We have a study right now that is live that we launched for 16 to 17-year-old adolescents, and we had over 2,000 adolescents apply to that by just meeting them where they were at in their social media spaces. So I think that's one thing that's really fantastic. Another thing that some of us are faced with is like administration of structured clinical interviews for diagnostic purposes. And often those have to be clinical rater administered, or they have to be physician administered. And when you're a patient, to your point, right, Kimberly, you might have to come in for that. That's a lot of hassle if you have children, if you're a single parent, if you have to pay for childcare. And so the idea of offering to meet someone where they're at, where they can get that assessment done in the privacy of their own home at their convenience, is another huge benefit of thinking through decentralized clinical trials.
I think it's just cost effective. I do think when you're looking at the cost of overall running a traditional study versus a decentralized study, it's a cost effectiveness. And this is why I think you can see a lot of digital therapeutics, liking that idea, right? Because they can save a lot of money from an operational standpoint. I don't think you're saving that much money, maybe perhaps not in recruitment, because it may be taking still a little bit longer to recruit patients remotely, right? You have to verify diagnosis, or perhaps in not having your data available from EMR or clinical data available. But I do think you're saving costs from an operational standpoint. Also, there's a less burden on the PI. You can have a lot of remote, data analysis or data verification. You can do it. There's probably less cost in staff. As you mentioned, right, like you don't have to have a bunch of staff that's going around and per site. Also, cost associated with setting up sites and running them and training individuals, training, physicians to kind of get these sites up and running. So.
Yeah, and I think building off that, there are also some important time efficiencies at multiple levels. So for the patient, not having to commute to a clinic to be assessed, or even in terms of efficiencies of automatic data capturing and automation, ensuring there's appropriate safeguards in place around safety. I think in terms of data capturing, for sure.
Adam, you had mentioned during your talk, like patient retention, and we all are invested in patient retention. We want the patient to have a good experience. We want enough data at the end to analyze. So I think that's really helpful too in streamlining those efficiencies that you all have mentioned.
So when we're comparing decentralized clinical trials to traditional studies, like any other, I know we've spoken about a few comparison points where decentralized trials really are winning the game if we were to compare them. Any other points that we haven't touched on that you'd like to discuss?
Well, the only thing I was going to say with decentralized, I think we keep forgetting, and we shouldn't forget that, the human interaction and finding that right balance between the, human interaction versus this decentralized is the key here. That hybrid, somewhat of a hybrid model, right? So I think that's the key, because there are some patients, perhaps, especially if we're working in mental health environment, right, and conducting study related to that. There's a key there that a patient may not understand the study, may not fully, e-consent process or data, how their data is being utilized, or in digital health, it's like also data privacy, right? People are afraid. Yes. And then you bring on AI, right? And you're talking to them or chatting with them. And I think it's important to have that human interaction to kind of walk them through what is the treatment they're getting, what is the process, how is their data being collected, and how are we going to use it, right? And just sort of security around it as well would be, I think those are some of the things that are a little bit different when it comes to it. So traditional versus, digitalized or decentralized to go.
Yeah, no, and I would just build on that to say that the majority of trials are hybrid. So I think Adam mentioned that only 5 to 10% are fully virtual. So we're a big believer ourselves in that hybrid approach. And specifically related to e-consent, having that ability to do that video visit and walk the patient through what does the e-consent actually say? Because unfortunately, they still are really long, the consent documents. And so without someone to help them understand all the legalese, most people are not going to understand what's in that consent document and what are they actually consenting to. So it's nice, again, to have that human interaction, even if it's on video, they're getting that human interaction. Yeah. And then the only other thing I would say is that we have seen an acceleration in patient recruitment with decentralized clinical trial methods. So we did, it was called the COVID Red study with the World Health Organization last year, and we were able to recruit 17,000 patients in 15 weeks, which would normally take 2 years. So we deployed a method of just saying, getting the word out, having them go through the pre-screener, being able to consent them rapidly. And obviously with the pandemic, that was very important. So, and the good news about the pandemic, if there's some good news, is that we can do it. So we've proven as an industry that we can accelerate timelines. And kudos to Pfizer and Moderna, J&J, who were able to successfully do that and get a vaccine to the masses. So that's the good news.
Yeah, and not just numbers, but also, as we said, representation.
Yeah,
hopefully
exactly.
The samples and the people who we're hearing their voice from is more representative as well.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a good point. I think there's still areas for us to grow and learn together in, right? Like there's Castor and Curebase and the sponsors as well, as we're continuing to administer these. And it's not a panacea yet. We want to really understand, how do we reach those minoritized populations? How do we make clinical trial awareness really easy for patients in need who don't have other access? Maybe there's registries, et cetera. I think there's a new association, hopefully I get the name right, but it's like Decentralized Trials Research Association or something like that, who's having their inaugural meeting, I think in November of this year. But and I think there's some sponsorship from people in the room of that organization, but it's really helpful to think about how much commitment is going into understanding decentralized trials towards the patient's benefit.
Building off that point, I did wonder if, yourselves, if your experience with decentralized or hybrid trials, trying to get a representative patient sample in terms of engagement and recruitment, other tips, strategies, ideas of how you can do that with hybrid or decentralized trials.
Kimberly, go ahead. I'd love to hear. I mean, this is always like someone earlier today mentioned humility when it comes to like DTX and growth. And this is where recruitment, we will always be evergreen in humility, right? We're trying to get our patients, we're trying to get representative samples. So if anybody else has ideas that we miss, call us, let us know. But I think one thing is to be very, very thoughtful in recruitment. At some point, you may need to monitor in real time. Someone spoke about dashboards earlier, that socio-demographic variables that you are recruiting. So at some point, maybe you are already reaching the amount that you want to hit with, non-Hispanic white females. And so you decide to limit the amount of those moving forward and open the spaces up for other minoritized populations. There's also some panels that you can set to try to hit target census numbers. Qualtrics offers a panel of that nature as well. And of course, the traditional things that many of us may be accustomed to in terms of being very, very thoughtful of your ads, your wording, your images, all of those things to really be inviting to people, in addition to liaising with other providers and things that we've done sort of traditionally.
I think one size fits all, and I think somebody else said that too. With ads, right, it doesn't work, right? An ad that might work in Boston, in this downtown area, right, around the language, right, about where you're trying to recruit patients versus someone in Vegas, right, or California, or someone, in areas that maybe the message is not well understood. Maybe the wording on the message is not what they're asking or, want. And so I think having multiple ads, understanding your demographics, understanding your patient target, and then speaking sort of in their language to recruit them. But also, there's a compliance aspect of what you can or cannot say. But I think it matters. I've seen ads, basically working for a mental health company, I get targeted on Instagram with a bunch of ads, right? Whoever is monitoring that, right? So I think it just depends on the areas and demographics. I think that we need to kind of come out of that one ad will work across the board in US, right? I don't think that's an approach that's feasible or should be reasonable across the board for recruitment.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to look at new and novel ways of reaching underserved populations. So I'm doing a diversity panel in a couple of weeks with J Labs. So Johnson & Johnson is obviously taking a close look at this. I think they have $100 million invested in really improving overall diversity. But as we went out and talked with people, one of the things we heard consistently was we need support as a community. And so all of us in this room have a lot of resources at our disposal, and things like, food deserts and impact that we can have. And the idea is that we create a long-standing relationship and partnership with underserved communities. And it goes something like, if you're serving those communities and then you have an ask at some point where you're saying, hey, we have a clinical trial we'd love for you to participate in. You've already built the relationship, you've already established trust, and that community is going to be much more likely to want to engage. So I think there's a lot that we can be doing as an industry to really be kind of the tide that raises all the boats.
That's a very important point. So actually building sustainable relationships and connecting with communities in meaningful ways. So as we look to the future, what do we think the future of clinical trials for digital therapeutics holds?
I think it's more of what we've been talking about a little bit, continuing to lean into growth mindset and working together as an industry and a field to share what we've learned and how we continue to improve all aspects, particularly, again, the patient centricity and understanding what is most helpful for the patient. We've also talked, I know Kimberly and I were chatting a little bit earlier today about interoperability, right? And really thinking about making sure everything is functioning on the back end. And because without that, it's not useful for any of the parties involved. So I think that is really helpful. I also think that, making sure that we understand what different stakeholders want, in terms of the sponsor, regulatory, the patient, payers, or other people that we are keen to, want to look at our data so that they reimburse our products. So there's a lot of learning that needs to be done and a lot of investment, I think, from the community as well to continue to try decentralized trial. But it's here. It's already here. I mean, COVID made it here. We've said it time and time again. It really accelerated things. So it's time to kind of keep going.
Yeah, and I would just add too, similarly, seamless patient journey is really, and I think what excites me is digital therapeutics really give us the opportunity to try that out. And I think it's something that hopefully will eventually become true for everyone, even for large scale pharma's phase 3 trials. But I think we're a long way from that yet. So there still is kind of this idea that I have to switch different apps and I'm kind of going from here to there. And we really have a vision that becomes seamless. It becomes very easy for people. And I think for all of us, we know in our personal lives, if it's not easy, we're not doing it.
Yeah,
We need that ease of use. I love my Instacart. I don't go to the grocery store anymore, so it's just, we have to create that experience for people if we want them to participate. So I think that's a big piece. I also think flexibility and choice. So you've heard a lot today about people talking about this idea of, having a visit at home or going into the office. Sometimes people want to decide, right? So I may say this week I'm busy. I have 1,000 things going on, so I want to have a remote visit. However, 2 weeks from now, I might be feeling really bad, and I might say, I really want to go see my physician, and that shouldn't be rate limiting for people. Like, our technology should support that. People should be able to do that. I love the idea of, if you're in an urban region, you can pick your site. You can pick your time if you want to go in, or you don't have to. So I think we need to be able to support that. And the last piece I would just say, and echoing some of what Adam said earlier too about data collection, we've got to have that standardized data. We've got to be thinking about it when we collect it. It's not just, your old school EDC data, I like to say, but we've got all kinds of data coming in now from wearables and devices and your digital halo. All of that needs to be standardized so that you can get it out in a meaningful way. Because if we're collecting a bunch of data and we can't really use it in a meaningful way, then we've kind of missed the point. So I think the future of clinical trials, we'll see more of that.
Mona, did you want to add anything?
I just want to say, I think we need to work on demystifying clinical trials all at once, right? I think you think of clinical trials and you think of like something is happening, we're testing something out, right? I think it's important for the regulators. It's important for the payers. It's important for the patients, right? Just demystifying what it is and educating the newer generation of ACPs that are coming in, understanding how clinical trials are run, what we're collecting, and be part of that innovation as well, right? And it should be somehow then become part of the clinical pathway of how they're looking at their patients and having this sort of availability of clinical trials available to them across the board, right? So it shouldn't be, and on some clinicaltrials.gov, you have to go in and see what's happening. But part of it in this integration platform where everybody's sort of involved, right? As a community, we heard that throughout the day today. We need to work as a community, right? So we need to advance this innovation in clinical trials as a community, every person playing their role to, the betterment of our society.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to now open it up to the audience to see what questions you might have for our panel about clinical trials and the next generation of what they're going to look like.
Yeah, I have a question in regards to that question about, what do the clinical trials of the future look like for not only digital therapeutics, but kind of all devices? Thinking about how, with drugs as sort of a model, one of the major, I wouldn't say revolutions, but evolutions was going from your typical phase 1, 2, 3 to more adaptive designs. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I haven't really seen with devices and certainly not in digital therapeutics. So I'm just wondering if any of the panelists, especially those of you who are actually have products in the clinic, if you guys have thought about maybe different ways to assess, rather than going feasibility, pilot, and pivotal to something that's more modular. And as you're getting data back from the patients, in some of these models, to actually get more data and potentially shorten the timeline between, the start and market.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question.
So I can take that. As we're developing medical devices, I think I think it's newer, right? So we're just evolving and we're learning what to do. I think for us, I can speak from our experience or some of the digital therapeutics company we work for. If your core mechanism isn't changing, you can take the learnings of your previous trials that you've done, right, and see what you can do to improve it. Perhaps you don't have to run a pilot data on newer population if there's some sort of maybe AI model, right, that we can leverage and run some sort of a feasibility, right, like data, you plug in the data, the AI model should be able to push it back and say, what's the likelihood of success, right, from this pilot? And instead of rerunning similar pilots across the board.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, and there are ways to be creative here. And this group really brings together a bunch of creative scientific minds. One thing, to consider is like synthetic arms, adding that to your clinical trial. So you have a method of getting real world data, in a historical way and integrating that. So there are definitely ways to continue to think about creative science design.
And I think also recognizing one trial isn't going to answer all the questions. Like, it's not necessarily going to answer the questions around return on investment or cost savings versus clinical effectiveness. So, it's figuring out what's the purpose of this trial and what's the next step we're trying to take. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Cindy Williams from Quinton. It's a digital therapeutic for self-management of diabetes, and really enjoyed the discussion, so thank you very much. I'm curious, you mentioned on the side of recruitment and kind of multi-site trials and how do you just have as diverse a population as possible. The things that you talked about are all things that, as a direct-to-consumer therapeutic provider, you would do. You would really fine-tune the messaging and the creatives, and you target the audience as well. Just to acquire customers and then to apply that also to the recruitment for the trials. And I'm just curious about, are there areas where that doesn't work? Is where there's, for some reason, sort of regulatory, can you just take whatever you did in Happify and in Willbot to get consumers on your app and how you've targeted folks and apply that to join this trial? Or are there?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. If I understand correctly, Mona, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So we have a suite of products, emotional support products at Willbot Health. So our direct-to-consumer application is not the same as our prescription digital therapeutic pipeline. And so we would really want to be careful about the level of advertising and setting patient expectations about what participation would involve. So it is slightly different from that route. In terms of our general kind of Willbot app that's readily available in the market, we haven't fiscally invested in marketing to date. That the people that come have just come. That's very different than recruitment, where we are investing money for clinical trials to get a particular patient population. So those dashboards are real-time data that I was mentioning about monitoring the amount or socio-demographic variables of people and their self-identity as they come through has been really helpful. In one of our recent National Institute of Drug Abuse funded studies, we increased our male participant population by 10% to be over a third when it was just a quarter before. So that was one way that we helped to do it. So I see that it's a little bit different than our general D2C app. Thank you for the question.
I agree. I think that the claims are different, right? So it's hard to then take the data that you have for your consumers and then apply it for a chronic condition population, right? What you can do is learn maybe usability of your app, right? Maybe software validation data that could be used across the board. But I think when it comes to claims, there's limited amount what you can kind of transfer from your consumer apps to your little bit more patient-specific, chronic conditions population.
We've got some questions from the online audience here. So what are some considerations regarding outcome measures / metrics for DTX trials as compared to traditional pharma trials?
Well, I don't have a pharma background, so I might have to comment.
Yeah.
But I mean,
I'm here for you.
Thank you. Thank goodness we're together. Yeah. No, in DTX, and I don't know what your experience has been, Mona, we haven't been sending people in for labs, and so a lot of pharmacotherapy trials, there might be scheduled labs where you have to get blood draws, et cetera, urinalysis, what have you, in order to understand patients, in order to make sure you're doing safety assessments regularly throughout the way. So there are some things that would be different in regards to that. But that being said, to your earlier point, it sounds like the decentralized trial ecosystem can accommodate patient preference and site selection, et cetera.
So I think the endpoints are different, right? So the endpoints doesn't really, to me, they're kind of separate, right? So you got traditional trials, how you run trials, but your digital endpoints or your endpoints are based on what you are collecting, the claims you want to make or an indication for use, right? So I'm not sure the outcomes we're looking at on would be depending on, again, your indication for use. It's not so much about the type of trial you're running. So that's what I would say. I think it just depends on what you're looking at, and it may differ.
Yeah, and I mean, the only thing I would add is, obviously in big pharma, you've got a lot of safety and efficacy, issues. And I would say with digital therapeutics, we're looking at efficacy, primarily. So, I mean, obviously safety too, but if you're not ingesting, obviously a drug, a little bit different. But I do agree. I think, you still, if you think about clinical research, you have a scientific hypothesis. This is what your hypothesis is. This is what you believe the efficacy of that therapy is going to be, whether it's a drug, a medical device, or a digital therapeutic. And then you would expect your outcomes data to support, that claim.
And regardless, we want to stick to the protocol, right? We want to identify the methodology for assessing safety, because regulatories can be quite interested in safety. So I know a lot of pharmacotherapy trials, as well as digital therapeutic trials, utilize, things like the HAMD, the MADRS, for examples for outcomes for depression, or the Columbia Suicide Risk Assessment Scale. So things like that. It all depends on how you've set up your protocol as well.
And then we've got one final question from the online audience. What are your thoughts about potential needs for durability data? Meaning looking at what happens to the treatment effect once the DTX has stopped to, say, 3 to 6 months out. Is the bar higher versus drugs?
I'll give you that one.
I'm going to need you, Chris, can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I heard all of it.
What are your thoughts about potential needs for durability data? Meaning looking at what happens to the treatment effect once the DTX has stopped at, say, 3 to 6 months out. Is the bar higher versus drugs?
Is the bar higher
versus
drugs?
Yeah, so I think this is such a great question, and I wish we had, I'm trying to remember their names, but Liz from Anthem in today's earlier panel discussion, and I believe it was Ryan from another pair. Thank you, Chris. I knew you'd know. Up here with us to answer that very good question, because to something we were mentioning earlier, I think different stakeholders might have different interests in duration and durability, right? Some people might be like, hey, show me 1 month. Some folks might want to see 6 months or 12 months or even longer. And it's also interesting, as we look at digital therapeutics can set up frameworks for briefer interventions, yet are the periods of durability the same? Someone who might be on SSRIs for 6 to 12 months, what are the expectations for durability of remission there versus, an 8-week or 12-week DTX program? So it's really something that I think we have to put our theoretical brains together for, and as well as the conversations with the stakeholders to understand what type of durability is most meaningful.
Yeah, and I think related to that, like some of the apps in the mental health space are about skills training. So it's interesting to think about, are people still using these skills even if they're maybe not using the device or the app, versus medication, which may be more you've got to keep taking it in order to achieve desirable clinical outcomes.
That's a fantastic point. And how do we measure that,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And with what regularity?
Exactly. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, I'd like to thank a very big thank you to our fabulous panelists. Thank you. All right. So, closing out for the day. We have covered a lot of ground within one day. I mean, it's hard to believe we have 2 days to come. But I did want to just close out with an analogy that came to mind as I was listening to the presentations today. And that's around where our industry is at. And I think, we've moved past our infancy. We've moved past establishing clinical evidence to show that there's great value for digital therapeutics and interventions. So I very much see us as in our adolescence. And with adolescence comes lots of turbulence and potential for more growth, and really thinking and being very mindful around whose attention we're trying to attract, for what reasons, and what's the best approach to doing that as we talk about greater alignment between key stakeholders to achieve a unified vision of how we're going to move forward for the greater good of all society. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful night, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.